Okay, guys, Timmy coming at you again. Here we go. We're going to talk about metabolism today. And real simply, I'm going to give you some overview, and then I'm going to get into a little more detail. But the bottom line is this. Cells need energy. And the only place they can get it is from this molecule called adenosine, 1Z, 2Z, tri-Z, phosphate, or ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So when a cell uses energy, when you need to contract a muscle, when you need to think a thought, sing a song, whatever, you get that energy from this molecule ATP. And how you use that energy is you break off this third phosphate. And when you break off the third phosphate, you release energy. That energy is used to contract a muscle, put amino acids together, tons of other things. Everything that the body does requires energy. Now, we're not perfect, so not all that energy is released in the form of the energy to move molecules, but some of it's dissipated as heat. That's why you get hot when you exercise. You have to use more ATP to contract more muscle. Here's the key. So once you've hacked off that third phosphate, what's left over is this molecule called adenosine diphosphate, 1-di. So there's two phosphates connected. And then you got this little lonely phosphate that would really like to be connected again. So when you use ATP, you build up ADP inside the cell. So as ADP builds up, you have to take ADP, reattach that third phosphate to make more ATP to allow the cells to do what they do. And where you get that energy is from the food that you eat. So you eat food, your digestive system breaks it down, and then you get the constituents or what's left of that food. And it is carbs, and we know glucose, fat, lipid, or amino acids. Now again, look, we need amino acids, these guys right here, to chemically bond them together to make proteins. So it wouldn't make sense, usually, to use amino acids to break the chemical bonds that held these guys together and try to make ATP from them. So rarely are amino acids used to make ATP. So the two fuels that you're left with are fat and glucose. And write this down, tattoo it someplace. You always use the fuel that's most readily available. And what dictates that is insulin. And we talked about this. So I'm going to go over now the functions of insulin. And I want all of these explained to me. Here you have a cell. Who cares? Here you have a capillary. Here you have a fat cell. And I will just tell you, there's fat in a fat cell. So remember that the goal of the body is to maintain homeostasis. And homeostasis for your blood sugar is 80 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. The reason that you want your blood sugar between 80 and 100 is the only fuel that the brain can use is glucose. So you want to make sure that the brain has enough fuel to run properly. So if you eat food, your blood sugar is going to go up. Also, your triglyceride level is going to go up. That's fat in the blood. Also, you're probably going to eat some protein, so the amount of amino acids in your blood are going to go up. What up, G? So when your blood sugar goes up, you want to make sure that glucose is the most readily available fuel for these cells to use to make ATP. So when your blood sugar is elevated, the pancreas senses it and releases the hormone insulin into the blood. The function of insulin is to bind to a functioning insulin receptor on the cell. And then when it does that, it's going to open up a gate to allow glucose to go from the blood into the cell. So now you have glucose in the cell. Here's the thing. To make sure that glucose is the most readily available fuel, insulin does some other things to guarantee that. Remember, you have triglyceride floating in your blood. So another function of insulin, besides allowing glucose into the cell, is it will take fat and store it in fat cells. If fat, triglyceride, is stored in the fat cell, it can't be used by this cell to make energy. That guarantees that glucose will be the most readily available fuel. Furthermore, any fat that was already stored in the fat cell, insulin locks it up. So insulin locks up fat in a fat cell, and it takes any fat that was in the fat cell or was in the blood and stores it in fat cells. That guarantees that fat cannot be used by energy for the cell. Another function of insulin is to allow amino acids into the cell. And since you already have glucose being used, you will use those amino acids to make protein. So any hormone, like insulin, that builds protein is anabolic. Another function of insulin is that insulin directly stimulates the sodium-potassium pump. So what it will do is it will take 3 sodiums that leaked into the cell through those sodium leak channels, those sodium protein ion leak channels, and we'll pump them out. And 2 potassiums that leaked out, it will pump them in. Because you're working against a concentration gradient, that requires ATP. Another function of insulin is that it decreases cholesterol production by the liver. And finally, as a side note, insulin aids in healing. This is the reason why diabetics don't heal so well. Their lack of insulin and other factors, but one of the big factors is their lack of insulin prevents them from healing. That's why their toes rot off and they have to get their leg chopped off, because they can't heal wounds. So those are the functions of insulin. So insulin dictates, again, when or how glucose becomes the most readily available fuel. And that's, again, that's exactly what you want when your blood sugar is high. So real quickly, let's talk about what would happen if you didn't have insulin. So if you are a type 1 diabetic and you don't have insulin, let's see what happens. And again, my goal for you is to understand. If you understand the normal functioning of insulin, then you'll know what will happen if you don't have insulin. So again, fat is in a fat cell, and it's stored in the form of triglyceride. So if you eat sugar and you are a type 1 diabetic and you do not have insulin, your blood sugar is going to go up. And because you don't have insulin released by the pancreas, then insulin can't bind to the receptor and open up the gate. So what that does is that makes glucose, what up, G? It is impermeable. It cannot go from the blood into the cell. You need insulin to unlock that gate. So the cells need energy, right? So you eat some fat and you don't have insulin. So can glucose go into the cell to make ATP inside the cell? No, because you don't have insulin. And the other thing that insulin does is it keeps fat in a fat cell. So there's no longer insulin to keep fat in a fat cell, so there's like little diving boards. Yee, them Duke boys got my money. So tons of fat is going to be dumped into the blood. And what makes or what determines the fuel that's most readily available? Insulin. Without insulin, you can't use glucose, and therefore fat, triglyceride, will be the most readily available fuel. And it is fat, triglyceride, that will be the fuel that's most readily available. So if tons of fat are dumped into the blood, and fat is the only fuel that can be used to make ATP inside your cells, then fat will be that fuel. And that is why type 1 diabetics, before they're treated, one of the symptoms is they lose a ton of weight because they can't use glucose. So the only fuel that becomes available is fat. Now, we learned this. We learned that if stuff can't move, water can always move. So you have the hypothalamus. And now you have a bunch of glucose in the blood. And what up, G? And because glucose cannot go from the blood into the H cell, water can always move. So water always moves from an area of a lot of water and less stuff to an area of more stuff and less water. So you are removing water from the hypothalamus, and that will dehydrate the hypothalamus. And anytime you dehydrate the hypothalamus, that triggers thirst. That's why they get thirsty. And the only fuel that the brain can use, and I mentioned this before, is glucose. So if glucose can't get from the blood into the H cell, the hypothalamus thinks that you are starving, so you will eat. That's why they eat a lot, even though they're losing weight. And I told you this before, that anytime you increase your blood volume, and you will, because your blood sugar is high all over, all the cells of the body, all of them, all. Because your blood sugar is high all over, water will move out of all the cells by osmosis from an area of a lot of water and less stuff to an area of more stuff and less water. The result is that you will add water to your bloodstream, and anytime you increase your blood volume, you increase your blood pressure. When you increase your blood pressure, for whatever reason, it makes you pee more. So that's why they pee a lot. So again, if you understand what insulin does, then you will understand what happens if you don't have insulin. That's my goal for you. And let's be honest, at some point as a nurse, you will be taking care of diabetics. And to understand this is critical, because then you'll know what to do for these people. So if their blood sugar is high, why is it high? They don't have insulin. So you know that you're going to have to give them insulin. Also, water is getting sucked out of all those cells, and the cells need water for all their chemical reactions. So you're going to have to rehydrate those cells too. So even though they're drinking a lot and peeing a lot, the cells are going to be dehydrated. So let's talk about metabolism for a little bit. So again, what's our goal? Our goal is when we use ATP inside the cell, what's left over is ADP. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is the process of how, after we've used ATP, how do we pop on that third phosphate to ADP to recycle it into ATP so you continue to do what you do. And again, where do you get that energy to pop on that third phosphate? And the answer is that you eat food. And again, the three fuels that you use to break down inside your body are, oops, hang on, let me just erase this. Are glucose here, fat here, and amino acids. And I explained to you that for the most part, we don't use amino acids to break down inside our cells to pop on that third phosphate because we need those to make ATP. So the fuels that you are going to use are glucose. Here, you don't even know the chemical structure, and fat. So once glucose gets inside the cell, enzymes of metabolism, and the job of enzymes is to break the chemical bonds. And you learned in chemistry that this carbon and this oxygen are bound together by electrons. So what enzymes do is enzymes break those chemical bonds. And when you break those chemical bonds, you release those electrons. And those electrons have the ability to create energy. They have the ability inside a cell to take ADP, pop on that third phosphate, and recycle ADP into ATP. So again, because this bond right here and this bond right here are different, that's going to require a different enzyme. So this is enzyme 1, it breaks this bond, and enzyme 2 is going to break this bond. So metabolism is nothing more than a series of enzymes that break the chemical bonds of glucose and fat. And it will use glucose or fat, and it will use whatever's most readily available. So I just explained to you that insulin determines that. So let's talk about this for a minute. So when glucose gets inside the cell, there are basically 3 phases to metabolism. So when your blood sugar's high, insulin's going to be around. Insulin's going to bind to the receptor, open up the gate, and allow glucose, what up G, to get into the cell. So if the cell needs to recycle ADP into ATP, the first phase that glucose goes to is the anaerobic phase. A couple of things about the anaerobic phase. Number one, it occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. So you have enzymes out there that will begin to break it down. Anaerobic metabolism is very, very fast, much faster than aerobic. However, it only makes a few ATP. The big thing is that it doesn't require any oxygen. That's why it's anaerobic. And only glucose can go through anaerobic metabolism. After the anaerobic phase, there are 2 phases in the mitochondria. And the mitochondria we talked about. It's where you perform aerobic metabolism. And aerobic metabolism means that an absolute requirement is that it requires oxygen. Now, aerobic metabolism is much slower, makes ATP much slower, but it's the complete breakdown of glucose, and because of that, you make a lot of ATP, a ton of it. Compare. As a matter of fact, you make 2 ATP in aerobic metabolism, and you make 34 ATP. I'm sorry, 2 ATP in anaerobic metabolism and 34 ATP in aerobic. And so if you want to break something down, you want to do it aerobically because it's the best way to get the maximum amount of ATP out of that molecule of glucose. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to explain to you the pathway for aerobic or anaerobic metabolism, anaerobic. So again, we have glucose in the cell, and glucose is a 6-carbon compound. So if the cells need ATP, then glucose is going to get broken down. So there's a series of enzymes inside the cytoplasm that will begin to break those chemical bonds. And when you break those chemical bonds, you release energy. And in this case, it's enough to take ADP, adenosine 1,2, adenosine diphosphate, pop on that 3rd phosphate to recycle ADP into adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And that's exactly what you want to do. However, when you break those chemical bonds, it's not glucose anymore. It's this molecule called pyruvate. And pyruvate is a 3-carbon compound. And when pyruvate is formed, it forms a free-floating hydrogen ion. And any chemical that forms free-floating hydrogen ions is an acid. So if you recall, we talked about the pH scale. And if the amount of free-floating hydrogen ions goes up, then the pH goes down. So pyruvate can make the inside of the cell acidic. So pyruvate has to be handled. The problem with pyruvate is that it is impermeable to the cell membrane. It cannot leave the cell and go into the blood. So the only place that pyruvate is permeable to is the mitochondria. So pyruvate from the cytoplasm will diffuse high concentration to low into the mitochondria. So I'll end it there, and then I'll pick up the next phase of metabolism, which is the aerobic phase of metabolism.